I'm Richard Avermenko. I'm the director of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, which is currently being rebranded the Civic School, I hope. I know an event called Teaching Women that no one came here to hear me speak, so I'll make this very short. You've all heard of the French Revolution, right? There was this group of, too loud? What? Too quiet? You can't hear me? All right. You've all heard of the French Revolution, right? That's when this group of revolutionaries called the Girondins, right? They were revolutionaries. They came in, they killed a bunch of people. And then the Jacobins came in and killed all the Girondins. They were even more revolutionary. Well, the American Revolution wasn't like that. And I would like to submit to you, it wasn't like that because of the women. It was the women who kept the men sane. And among those women, what's called the founding mothers, was a woman named Mercy Otis Warren. And this event tonight is an event that is part of our Mercy Otis Warren initiative. Mercy Otis Warren, when she was in her 70s, she wrote a multi-volume history of the American Revolution. There are accounts of Mercy Otis Warren. John Adams, for example, wrote to Mercy Otis Warren saying, I'm almost embarrassed every time I'm around you. You're the smartest person I've ever met. Something like that. Mercy Otis Warren, no Mercy Otis Warren, no Bill of Rights. So a year, 2 months, 17 hours, 3 minutes ago when I arrived here to start this new job, second thing I did here was started the Mercy Otis Warren Initiative. In a time of revolution, I think we need to call on our women to keep us sane. And that is the purpose of the Mercy Otis Warren Initiative. And it is why I got so lucky as to bring Erica Bacchiacchi into the SCETL fold, the Civic School. Erica will moderate and take over from me so I can go sit down over there and learn. Erica is a legal scholar who works at the intersection of constitutional law, political theory, women's history, and Catholic social teaching. She lives in the Boston area, which we will forgive her for. We don't really know if she's a Red Sox fan, but that would be unforgivable. She's also the editor and the originator of our online journal called Fair Disputations, and it's a big part of the Mercy Otis Warren Initiative. If you haven't read any of the articles that show up in Fair Disputations, I strongly encourage you to do this. It is an excellent publication. It's on our website. I'm going to turn over. Nobody wants to hear me talk. Everyone wants to hear Erica and the other women here, who she will introduce. I will not bore you with it. So no Mercy Otis Warren. We have a French Revolution. No Erica Bacchiacchi. No Mercy Otis Warren Initiative. Please welcome Erica Bacchiacchi. Thank you so much.
So thank you all for coming out tonight. I'm really pleased to be here. So the title of our panel, Teaching Women, Exemplars for the Good Life, is a kind of provocation, intentionally so, because nearly every word in that title is fraught in the modern university, isn't it? From the underlying kind of biological and even metaphysical question of what it is to be a woman, to the baked-in assumption that maybe there's something that distinguishes women from men that might make teaching women distinctive, whether teaching female students in the classroom or teaching female authors and thinkers and historical figures on the page. And then that subtitle, Exemplars for the Good Life. Are there some ways of living that might be better than others, more noble, more praiseworthy? And is it really possible to hold up exemplars around us, in our midst, and also from the past, who live this thing called life in an exemplary way? And so I've invited 3 exemplary teachers and scholars to help us think about these questions tonight. But before I introduce them and let them take the stage, I want to make some introductory observations of my own that will also serve to introduce what we hope for with the Mercy Initiative, why it exists, and what we're aiming at. So in my own academic study, you heard some of kind of subjects I think about, but this is my one advertisement for my course this spring and summer on, it's called Women and Rights in the Western Political Thought. So I do a lot of work on women in the Western political tradition. So in my own kind of study of these important female figures in the development in particular of women's equal dignity and women's rights, as well as, you heard, our namesake, Mercy Otis Warren, there's a kind of common thread, I've noticed, a shared kind of enabling cause behind their transformative works. I'm going to talk particularly, and just briefly here, about three: Christine de Pizan, a 15th century figure, Mary Wollstonecraft, an 18th century figure, and then a bit about Mercy Otis Warren herself. Each of these women was uniquely for her time liberally educated. So they each had access to teachers and libraries, books that enabled them to really study great texts and think through kind of questions about who am I, how am I to live, how are we to live, are there more noble, more praiseworthy kinds of lives. So Christine de Pizan, how many people have heard of Christine de Pizan? Good. Hopefully you're all, of course, here at SCETL, hopefully you're reading her. If you come to my class, you'll be reading lots of her. So she was the first female to earn her own living by her own pen, and she was educated very young by having access to this massive library that was collected by her father's employer, who was the French king, King Charles V. And so she had access and read voraciously Plato and Aristotle and Cicero and Plutarch, and you can see this in her writing. Her political works as a widow and a mother of three were commissioned by the court of Charles V and are steeped in Western political thought. And then her writings on women, in particular, The City of Ladies, she challenges, knowing Aristotle very well and really working within the Aristotelian tradition, she challenges explicitly and kind of performatively Aristotle's account of woman's kind of lack or want of full reason, setting in motion a centuries-long querelle de femmes, which is kind of the question about women. She writes, "The man or woman in whom resides the greater virtue is the higher. Neither loftiness nor the lowliness of the person lies in the body according to sex, but in the perfection of conduct and virtues." So on the tail end of that querelle de femmes, Mary Wollstonecraft herself is best known for her late 18th century political treatises, but she was first an autodidact, a pedagogue, and a teacher. Her little-known work, The Female Reader, collects works of Shakespeare, Milton, the Bible, and other literary writings for, she says, the improvement of females. Knowing they needed exemplars, she encouraged her students to, quote, "study the noble models of antiquity till the imagination is inflamed, that you may imitate without copying those great originals." And if one reads very carefully her political works, especially having read these earlier works, you can see replete in these works biblical allusions and great learning from within the Western canon, especially in the natural law tradition. And then there's Mercy Otis Warren, who is also liberally educated, alongside her brothers, who cultivated, as you heard, a towering intellect that was and she was admired by many of the American founders, even as she raised 5 children. It was because of her extensive study of the Western canon that she was able to compose this picture of the soul in her important history of the American Revolution. And I quote, "The study of the human character opens at once a beautiful and a deformed picture of the soul. We there find a noble principle implanted in the nature of man that pants for distinction. This principle operates in every bosom, and when kept under the control of reason and the influence of humanity, it produces the most benevolent effects. But when the checks of conscience are thrown aside, or the moral sense weakened by the sudden acquisition of wealth or power, humanity is obscured. So what the Mercy Initiative here at SCETL recognizes is that the liberal arts education that these women worked so hard to achieve for themselves, so uniquely for their times, the study of great texts and great big questions, that they commended to others too, an education that inquires into kind of the nature of the good life, is not one commended to American women and men today. In its place, we have sort of progressive education, skills building, preparation for a career. But without this study in the human character that Mercy Otis Warren commends and discusses, that is the subject or part of the subject of the liberal arts, we are unable to really even access or understand the wisdom that these women, these exemplary women in many ways in their thought, Pazan and Wollstonecraft and Warren, and those we'll be talking about today, kind of the wisdom and the guide of life that they might offer us. It's as though they speak in a language foreign to us, and their works, many of which are little known today. And so what we're trying to do with the Mercy Otis Warren Initiative is not only kind of commend and retrieve these great women who kind of work within the Western tradition and are upholding and thinking within the Western tradition, but we're also trying to support and encourage the study and the scholarship of women today working in the Western tradition. And so this is why I brought 3 great women today who are working and teaching within the Western tradition to help us think about teaching women exemplars for the good life. So without further ado, let me introduce the 3, and I'll just introduce them briefly and then ask each one to come up. Okay, so Katie Elrod is first. She is the head of Montrose School, which is a high-achieving, independent liberal arts school in the Boston area for girls grades 6 through 12. Having had one of their incredible students as my RA, my research assistant, while she was at Harvard, they are a very impressive bunch. So it's a real honor for us to hear what it is that they do, the mysterious things that they do there at Montrose. Next, Angel Parnham, who is the Associate Professor of Sociology and Senior Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies and Culture at the University of Virginia. She is also Associate Director for UVA's major in Political and Social Thought, where she equips students to examine transformations in political and social thought from antiquity through the present. And she is also the author, most recently, of the important book, The Black Intellectual Tradition, Reading Freedom in Classical Literature, that was published in 2022. And then finally, Christina Lambert, who comes to us from Hillsdale College, where she's an assistant professor of English and teaches, to the great acclaim of her students, some of whom I know quite well, American literature. So we'll be hearing from her in the 3rd place. So without more from me, Katie, come on up.
So thank you, everyone, for coming, and thank you, Erica, for inviting me to participate in this panel hosted by this amazing initiative. And this is my first time to Phoenix. I love it. It's warm. I'm enjoying it. Maybe you don't love it because it's always warm, but for me, from Boston, it's quite a treat. So I speak to you today as an educator of adolescent girls for almost 30 years. I'm actually in my 5th year as head of school. And as Erica said, this is an independent school for girls grades 6 through 12. And so even though I'm a practitioner, I'm unlike the other 2 speakers, or 3 speakers really, I'm not a scholar, but my background is in philosophy, so I'm always interested in asking the big, essential, and enduring questions. So in my role, because I don't teach anymore, I had to give myself my own essential question for my job. So I grapple with this overarching question, right? What do girls need in order to flourish and to become the best versions of themselves for others? And now I'm asking this question currently in a school that has a rich liberal arts curriculum with carefully chosen core texts. Many of those are classical. So as a result, I asked these other questions that Erica alluded to too, which is, can we talk about what it means to be a girl or a woman without having to reduce her down to feminine stereotypes, especially when some classical authors did not see women as fully rational? And are there distinctive differences between men and women? And how do we acknowledge them without having to compromise on equality between the sexes? So for today, what I wanted to talk about was the last question, though. How do girls, as girls, learn best, especially in a school rooted in and animated by a robust liberal arts curriculum? Since my current school, Montrose, is a girls' school, I've had that unique opportunity to have it serve as my own personal lab school. So I've been collecting data for the past 25 years, and so today I'm going to share a little bit about what I've learned and tell you why I think it matters. So here's the agenda. We're going to talk about a little bit what are the liberal arts. We're going to talk about what is liberal arts education for girls. I'm going to propose that a liberal arts curriculum for girls needs female exemplars. And then, if I get to it, I have a couple examples from my current school on some characteristics and curriculum on what that looks like. So let's start with what are the liberal arts. The liberal arts comes, we can talk about it, we're going to talk a little bit about the history, but this one sentence to me sums it all up. And it's actually a sentence that was given to me by one of my mentors. He was a philosophy professor at Boston College, and he said, essentially the liberal arts or the goal of them is the actualization of the best capacities within us. Best we would define as the highest capacities of the human person, which are our reason and will. So the liberal arts help us learn how to reason well and choose well. Actualization, that implies some kind of end. We know what we are aiming for, and in this case, it would be reason. And the goal of reason would be wisdom, not knowledge necessarily, but wisdom. And the goal of the will really is not skills, but virtue or some kind of excellence. The liberal of a liberal arts describes an educational tradition that celebrates and nurtures human freedom. It's a freedom for something. For what? It's really the freedom to develop one's powers of mind in order to pursue the truth, in order to discover meaning and engage the world. It's also just as important to have the freedom to develop one's will, to love authentically in order to build peace, diplomacy, and communities that stand for something. It's basically a freedom that we talk about at Montrose to help each girl discover her noble purpose. Now, historically, the 7 liberal arts were classically understood as the trivium and the quadrivium, and they were designed to nurture and cultivate our powers of mind. Logic, grammar, and rhetoric, activate and develop our capacity to think, read, understand, plumb for meaning, and communicate the truth effectively and coherently. Arithmetic, music, geometry, and astronomy are all about number, basic numeracy, in time, in relation, and in magnitude. These powers strengthen our freedom in tangible ways. They give us the capacity and strength of will to know how to pursue what is good and right, even under difficult circumstances. They give us an appetite, a taste for what is good and true and beautiful, and they awaken in us a desire to use one's time, talent, and energy to pursue noble ends. They develop our capacity for nuance, for reading the complexity of the human person, of conscience and decision, and a sympathy for the plight of those in difficult circumstances. They give us really an appreciation for context, upbringing, and all the variables that shape and inform a life. In other words, a liberal arts education helps us to become an expert in humanity. And I want to say it's not an expert in the humanities as opposed to the STEM subjects, but in humanity. The liberal arts does include science and math. So an expert in humanity is a sensitive reader, not simply of texts, but of the world around us and all its wonder and richness. So now is the question, are the components of a liberal arts education the same for women as it is for men? So I've taught in co-ed and single-sex classrooms, and of course, both men and women have the capacity to become wise and virtuous. However, I've found for girls, it matters what kind of text you read and the pedagogy you practice and in what environment you teach. So I have found this paradigm actually originates from a German 20th century philosopher, Edith Stein, that's helped me to ensure that the kind of education that I'm offering at my school is a robust liberal arts curriculum that also respects the distinctive nature of women and how each of them are individual. So my claim is that a liberal arts education for girls integrates these three parts of herself. She's fully human, she has the capacity for rationality and virtue, she's wholly woman, and she's totally unique. And if one part I think is emphasized over the other, I have found girls really struggle to flourish. And so what integrates all of these parts together for girls in a liberal arts education are female exemplars. It helps how each part of her doesn't become an extreme sort of caricature of the other. So when I think about these three female exemplars, though, they're not just women that we read about in books or hear about in class, right? They are living female exemplars in our classrooms, forming, mentoring, and inspiring them. So what does that look like in my lab school? So first, the texts and questions matter, right? The curriculum, as I've been saying, is made up of these highly curated, carefully selected texts that have a high percentage of female authors and or a female protagonist in our English classes, but also in history. We do spend time, yes, on Mary Wollstonecraft and Christine Pizan. But you can see here's 7th grade, which is actually probably one of my favorite curriculums because of the number of female authors and protagonists. In 9th grade, we continue the trend, but we also try to focus more on the psychological development, the complexity of the characters. This is a quote, a very long quote, which I'm not going to read, but this is from the literature teacher from the 9th grade, and a couple of sentences I want to pull out. She says, "We read classic works of literature with complex characters. We read these novels, plays, and poems, and we act them out. We reflect on each character and their words, actions, and relationships. Girls learn best when they are given the opportunity and time to share their insights about their relationships. And when they learn the vocabulary for these character traits, differences in personalities and behaviors." We are obsessed at Montrose about not only the text, but the questions. My great goal as an educator is to help each girl cultivate her interior world, to be able to figure out what her questions are in order for her to pursue her noble purpose. And so we have all kinds of signs around our school really activating this important aspect of education. In 11th grade, the grades and texts we are focused on the essential questions. And the one I wanted to focus in on was, what are the factors that influence how a woman forms her identity as a woman? Here in 11th grade, in AP Language class and composition, we have a lesson or a unit plan, and it's really 3 parts. And the whole goal is really to help the girls cultivate attention. And I know that we're gonna have another speaker who's gonna be talking about this also. But 16-year-olds tend to focus on themselves, so we try to help them focus on others. And we do that by actually having them interview women closest to them, which is a beautiful, really, activity. And what they do is they write descriptive essays about women that are closest to them. So obviously a lot of them write about their mothers or their sisters. And when they're able to write about them, they're able to sort of get to know all the different aspects of what it means to be a woman without reducing her to a stereotype or, some kind of rigid exemplar characteristics. And so when I look at this, when I looked at all the different examples, I found this great quote by one of a 16-year-old, is how has she described her mother? And I thought just as an excellent example. And the next part of the lesson plan is that they actually choose a woman that they want to research. And this young woman, Elena, won the outstanding paper for last year in her class because she chose Dorothy Hodgkins, who obviously is a Nobel Prize-winning chemist. And what I was fascinated with her paper, though, is that she focused on this question of what really helped her to become excellent at what she did. And what she acknowledged was her mentors, all the mentors in her life that helped her develop her powers of mind. And that, to me, is a sign of an understanding of what her noble purpose is. And finally, they have a panel discussion where they bring in their mothers. You can see one mother talking about this really important question, which is when you were 16, which is a really important question to ask, how did your story evolve and children become part of that story, right? What did I plan for in my college and professional life when I was 16, and how did the story evolve and children become part of that story? And the goal is to learn diverse ways women have managed these choices, and they come away impressed by the women and seeing the divergent patterns their pathways have taken. And then finally, I wanted to talk about interdisciplinary and real-world applications and why they matter. So this is a case study in elements of design and science and art. And I want to say one really important aspect of the interdisciplinary and real-world applications is that for girls especially, and there's a lot of research that shows that girls who do really well in their secondary schools in math and science, they often don't pursue that at the university level, not because they're not initially interested, but a lot of times they can't see the connections. They're not interested because they don't want to see the connections between the disciplines and the courses, and they lose interest. And another reason why they don't continue is because they have an expectation to achieve really high grades. Men, when they achieve the C in organic chemistry or in physics, will say, great, I'm moving on. For a girl, a lot of times she'll say, well, I must not be great at it. So these are the things we know right away. And so when we look and we're trying to teach the girls in a secondary setting, we're trying to help them come to understand that you don't have to get the A in order to pursue a STEM career, nor do you need to have, a full understanding of the connection. So what we do is we try to design courses that have this. So here's the elements of design in science and art. And this was a year-long focus this is a great quote by Leonardo da Vinci about the relationship between science and art that sort of exemplifies this point. But this is the elements of design in science and art really help them cultivate a lot of the different strengths of mind that they'll need in order to pursue a career in STEM. And Nancy Grace Roman was a woman that year that the teacher focused on. And Nancy Grace Roman was a 20th century American astronomer, best known as the mother of Hubble Space Telescope. And she was a pioneering scientist and one of the first female executives at NASA. So her leadership and vision earned her numerous awards. And the art teacher chose Nancy Grace Roman for all those reasons, but really she chose her for this reason. This is an autobiographical note that Nancy Grace Roman wrote about herself for a middle school audience. And it really captures what I know at our school we're trying to achieve for women when I think about female exemplars. She says, although I love astronomy and it gave me a wonderful career, I have other interests, both in and outside of the home. Working part-time lets me enjoy these as well. And I'm not sure I have hobbies. I like too many things. A major activity is reading. I'm in 2 book groups, she says. And I like to cook and sew, though I seem to have less time for them than I used to. And to me, this is really what we wanted to encourage the girls to grasp, is that this woman, yes, she had a lot of accomplishments in math and in science, But ultimately, she was really fully human, right? She was developed in all her powers of mind. She was curious, she was humble, she was fair-minded, and she was a free thinker. And that's really what we wanted to show. And these girls who didn't have an initial interest in science, because of this course, were able to fall in love with science. And so a lot of them designed special stickers for missions, because each NASA mission has a special sticker, and we designed actually ones for the Nancy Grace Roman mission. They designed their own telescope, which was a small model of the actual telescope down in DC, and then we actually spent time at the Goddard Space Flight Center looking at the telescope. And so finally, when I look at core text and STEM, these are the questions that I think are so important to ask, right? Why does math matter, right? How does it help me to become fully human? What are the excellent habits of a mathematician, engineer, and scientist? And then ultimately, what are our ethical obligations, right, to this field and society? Like, this is how STEM matters to girls. It matters to all human beings, but for girls especially. And so I just want to wrap up with, that's some great pictures of our favorite scientists and mathematicians. And then I just want to end with just a wonderful female exemplar that I think is someone I want to recommend everyone to pick up their book tonight. Does anyone know this book? Has anyone read it? Good. You all should get it tonight. It's one of my favorite books. And it's one of my favorite books because this is a woman who is a tree biologist. And she ran her own lab for many years, but she's also a poet, she's a comedian, she's a philosopher, and really she was a woman who understood her noble purpose, couldn't be, put into one category or one kind of job or one kind of, I want to say ultimately, reduced down to something that could be a stereotype, right? She was a woman who was always pursuing her questions. And that, I think, is the most important aspect of what liberal arts education is for girls, to pursue their questions so they can be free. Thank you.
Hello, good evening. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. And I will be speaking with you on the topic, In Search of Our Mother's Dreams, Women Envisioning the Good Life. What could it look like to take women's writing and voices seriously in curricula that center the teaching of classic and canonical text? How do we retrieve, teach, and learn from generations of women whose voices were so often suppressed that relatively few have come to us today in writing? I suggest that one way of doing this is to draw on the method of reflection and writing handed down to us by Alice Walker's In Search of Our Mother's Gardens and Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. We begin with Walker's commentary on Woolf in her essay, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. She wonders, with Virginia Woolf, how any woman of the past, filled with the desire for creative expression, could have survived the long millennia of women's silencing. In her reflections, we can hear Walker intertwining the experiences of Black women into Woolf's reflections as she writes. It's really quite interesting. She takes whole chunks of Woolf's essay, and then you'll hear her inserting the experience of Black women here. Genius of a sort must have existed among women as it must have existed among the working class. Walker inserts, add slaves and the wives and daughters of sharecroppers. Now and again, an Emily Bronte or a Robert Burns, insert Zora Neale Hurston or Richard Wright, blazes out and proves its presence. But certainly it never got itself onto paper. When, however, one reads of a witch being ducked or a woman possessed by devils, of a wise woman selling herbs, or even a very remarkable man who had a mother, then I think we are on the track of a lost novelist, a suppressed poet, of some mute and inglorious Jane Austen. Indeed, I would venture to guess that Anon, who wrote so many poems without signing them, was often a woman. It is this lost creative genius that Walker sets out to find in writing In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. As she reflects on her own mother, living in poverty with Alice and her siblings, she considers that though her mother did not write, did not compose poems of the conventional kind, yet she was a painter of beauty, her chosen medium being flowers. For it was literally in her great flowering garden that Walker's mother expressed the art within herself. In consideration of this revelation, Walker writes a kind of homage to her, saying, "I notice that it is only when my mother is working in her flowers that she is radiant, almost to the point of being invisible, except as creator, hand and eye. She is involved in work her soul must have, ordering the universe in the image of her personal conception of beauty. Her face, as she prepares the art that is her gift, is a legacy of respect that she leaves to me, for all that illuminates and cherishes life. She has handed down respect for the possibilities and the will to grasp them. For her, so hindered and intruded upon in so many ways, being an artist has still been a daily part of her life. This ability to hold on, even in very simple ways, is work Black women have done for a very long time." Walker's beautiful contemplation of her mother's art and the legacy of beauty she received from her encouraged me to look into my own past, to consider the legacy my own mother has left me, and how that legacy has shaped the work I do now. The first question I posed to myself, following Walker's lead, was, what is my mother's art? How has she given rein to her creativity? It did not take long for this to come to me. It is in her keen eye for color, design, and fine objects, and the careful curation of art, sculpture, and fine things. It is there in her gathering of beautiful fabrics and sewing them up into lush decorative pillows and royal blue cushioned upholstery. So while my mother has not written poetry and books, she lavished her creativity on us and in the beautiful place where she lives today. From her, I claim as an inheritance an eye for an irresistible draw to beauty in its manifold forms. I claim it in my love of poetry, art, literature, and music, which I collect all around me. This comes, I think, from a childhood of reading my mother's poetry off the walls. It was while I was in her home as a child that I came to love poets and poetry, foremost among whom is Emily Dickinson. Here, in order to better understand why Emily Dickinson's life and poetry were so important, indeed crucial to my well-being as a young girl, it's necessary to know that I was a lonesome, brooding teenager. I was so unusual, I know. I was usually off in my books, reading Gothic novels, dreaming of other places and other times. I felt, it's fair to say, quite out of step with my peers. What I loved, they did not love. What captured my imagination did not capture theirs. And so it was in the midst of this lonesome teenage desert that I met Emily Dickinson and was enfolded in and consoled by her fiercely brave, lucid poetry. We lived, I thought, a kind of mirrored seclusion. She in her 19th century home, rarely going out, and I in the seclusion of my mind, living a kind of solitary freedom beyond walls. One of my favorite Dickinson poems is "The Soul Selects Her Own Society." The soul selects her own society, then shuts the door. To her divine majority, present no more. Unmoved, she notes the chariots pausing at her low gate. Unmoved, an emperor be kneeling upon her mat. I've known her from an ample nation, choose one. Then close the valves of her attention like stone. This poem resonated with my sense that I was not so much rejected by others as I was uneager to join in idle games and pursuits that did not suit me. I saw myself as choosing my society and at the same time entering into the society of Dickinson, communing with her across time. I also meditated on and enjoyed the poem "Much Madness is Divinest Sense." Much madness is divinest sense to a discerning eye. Much sense, the starkest madness. 'Tis the majority in this as all prevail. Assent, and you are sane. Demur, you're straightway dangerous, and handled with a chain. These words reflected my sense that I had permission to be different, that despite the ways of the majority and the endless calls to conformity, there was something right about resisting, even though I would be accounted as odd by my peers. These two poems are just the surface of a much deeper fount from which I drew as I lumbered my way through adolescence, waiting to feel unawkward, waiting to feel more rather than less understood, and longing to find others in the flesh with whom I could relate and celebrate. I'm pleased to say that this time did come. My love of Dickinson and her work is one of the reasons I urge the importance of reading widely and deeply within the tradition, rather than trying to cultivate a course of study that hews very closely to a young student's cultural or ethnic background. While there should certainly be some reading where she can see people like herself, you can never know what authors, text, or art will spark the imagination or provide consolation in difficult days. But that said, we must also make room for our daughters to see something of themselves in the tradition. And for this, I turn to an 18th century poet, Phillis Wheatley. Virginia Woolf begins her famous talk by asserting that in order to write, a woman must have money and a room of her own. Phillis was a formidable poet who had neither, but who nevertheless found a space of her own. Perhaps it was a bench in the kitchen between preparing and cleaning up for meals. Perhaps it was hunched over the dim light of a candle after having completed the day's tasks for the Wheatley household. And while she may not have had money of her own in the earliest years when she was composing her first book of poetry, she was provided ink and paper enough to record her thoughts for posterity. With Phillis, I reclaimed the American story with my people in it as active, creative agents from the beginning. Through her eyes and pen, I gained access to colonial America from its most humble residents to its most exalted. On the exalted side, I come to know another side of George Washington than what is typically provided in civics classes. She wrote a poetic homage to him and sent it off in a letter. Washington received it and was so impressed that he had it published and invited her to come and meet with him. But as successful as she was, at least for a short while, she struggled mightily. As Woolf notes in her essay, while the world may discourage aspiring male writers and say to them, "Write if you choose, it makes no difference to me," when it comes to women, for most of history, the world said with a guffaw, "Write? What's the good of your writing?" And we see some of this frustration, of this dismissal, in Wheatley's poem On Imagination. She begins by praising the beauty and power of imagination. Thy various works, imperial queen, we see, how bright their forms, how decked with pomp by thee. Thy wondrous acts and beauteous orders stand, and all attest how potent is thine hand. Imagination is so powerful, in fact, that she can reverse the frozen world of winter, as we see in these verses. Though winter frowns to fancy's raptured eyes, the fields may flourish and gay scenes arise. The frozen deeps may break their iron bands and bid their waters murmur o'er the sands. And yet, despite her visionary power, even imagination is thwarted in some cases. After several stanzas where we fly on imagination's wings across time and space, following her to places previously unknown, Wheatley ends the poem on a dark note. She says, "The monarch of the day I might behold, and all the mountains tipped with radiant gold, but I, reluctant, leave the pleasing views which fancy dresses to delight the muse. Winter, austere, forbids me to aspire, and northern tempests damp the rising fire. They chill the tides of fancy's flowing sea. Cease then, my song, cease the unequal lay." Here at the end, winter triumphs, austere in its reign over her life. Tempests pour damp on the fire of her creative desire, and she is forced to cease her song, unequal to the challenges determined to stop her. Wheatley's life was one of great highs and sudden lows. She soared to the heights of international acclaim, but died in poverty and obscurity. A second volume of poetry reported to be in the works, but now lost to us. Studying her life and witnessing her great faith under difficulty and injustice gave me great sustenance and joy when I was writing my second book on the Black intellectual tradition. I'll close now with a third author who sustains and encourages me, Anna Julia Cooper. From Anna, I take the beauty and joy of learning and sharing the classical liberal arts with those our society has despised, demeaned, underestimated, or forgotten. Anna was born in the last few years before emancipation. She was enrolled at St. Augustine Normal School in North Carolina and argued her way into the classical track of study, which was formerly closed to girls. The intent was for boys to study the classics and then potentially embark upon higher study to become clergy. But Anna knew that she needed to study the classics too, and she knew she would excel, and she did. She went on to write, speak, and teach with boldness on the topic of civil rights and education. Cooper had a great love for bringing the classical liberal arts to the common Black person who the larger society assumed was unworthy of such study. In her speech entitled On Education, she explains her position this way. The Negro has had manual education throughout his experience as a slave. For 250 years, he was practically the only laborer in the American market. The old education made him a hand solely and simply. It deliberately sought to suppress or ignore the soul. We must, whatever else we do, insist on those studies by which the consensus of educators are calculated to train our people to think, which would give them the power of appreciation and make them righteous. Teachers from Aristotle to the present have sifted and analyzed the various branches of learning to get at their relative worth as educative factors. The results of their experiments and analyses are not hidden in dark places. It is from Anna Julia Cooper that I take inspiration to continue to find creative ways to pass on the tradition of great books and liberal arts, from Plato and Aristotle to W.E.B. Du Bois and James Baldwin, from Christine de Pizan and Virginia Woolf to Phyllis Wheatley and Toni Morrison. In doing this work, I have seen flowers blooming and a new generation of gardeners as younger girls take hold of these works. I think of Micaiah, a young girl in New Orleans who was part of the first program I did with my organization, Yansa Classical Community. I remember the joy on her face as she sang The Golden Apple Rap, adapted from the children's version of the Iliad we read that year. I think of the young girl in our Philly program who's been introduced to Greek mythology that's accompanied by imaginative renderings of the gods and goddesses. Aphrodite has brown skin and a beautifully sculpted afro. In response, the girl says, "I want to be Aphrodite. She's so beautiful." And I think of my daughter Julia and her creative dialogue with the poems of Emily Dickinson. In response to a home-based lesson on Dickinson, Julia created a poetry volume of her own, taking Dickinson's poems as a model and writing her own versions and commentary. I leave you here with one of her creations, entitled Sing Me a Song, based on Emily Dickinson's I Had a Bird in Spring. My blue jay leaves for the winter, it does not look back. But I know in my heart it doesn't matter, because I know its love for me doesn't lack. He always comes back with an icy song of the winter that is oh so long, that when it leaves me be, it has a beautiful flower on its beak. So, my blue jay, don't go and forget me. In her commentary on this poem, Julia writes, Emily talked about her pet robin leaving and then returning, but I think she was talking about something more. Maybe a friend or a family member that left. I think she didn't want them to forget her. With these reflections, inspired by Walker's In Search of Our Mother's Gardens and Woolf's A Room of One's Own, I hope that we similarly will not forget those women, published and not published, who have peopled our world and storied our lives with a beauty they could not contain within themselves. Let us remember them.
Good evening. Thanks very much to Erica for having me. Thanks to the Mercy Initiative. It's a pleasure to be here after such great remarks from Angel and Katie. And it is worth noting that my mother is in the audience this evening, who was my first and most important teacher. Especially after that last talk. So, we're talking about educating women, but I'm going to begin a little indirectly this evening, since indirection is the province of poetry. And I'm going to start by talking about the education of a tree. Bear with me. In her poem, A Tree Telling of Orpheus, Denise Levertov hands over the lyric eye to a sapling as it narrates its encounter with the ancient poet Orpheus. Overcome by fear and joy, the tree carefully puts words to the experience. Words that the tree learns as it listens. The poem reads, "Then he sang, and it was no longer sounds only that made the music. He spoke, and as no tree listens, I listened, and language came into my roots, out of the earth, into my bark, out of the air." Captivated by this music and the growth it creates, in terror but not in doubt, the tree runs after Orpheus and his song when he departs, confident that he must follow this bard. But what does it mean for a tree to follow a song? It means that it must painfully rip its roots out of the earth in order to run after the poet. I quote again here, "Clumsily stumbling over our own roots, we moved, we followed, all day we followed, uphill and down. We learned to dance, for he would not stop where the ground was flat. The words he said taught us to leap and to wind in and out. The singer laughed till he wept to see us. He was so glad." The tree attends so faithfully to the music of the bard, it literally unroots itself to keep pace with the rhythm. Why? For no words, language, movement, dance. The very form of the tree painfully changes in its devotion to the poet's song. Levertov here captures a stunning image of attention, of what it means to listen and attend so faithfully that you let yourself be transformed, even at great cost or pain. It is this image of unrooting in conversation with the poem's conclusion that makes it one of the great images of education, to my mind. So once they follow the poet into the grove, the poem describes, "He stilled our longing, he sang our sun-dried roots back into the earth, watered them." So near the poem's conclusion, the lyricist uses his talent to replant and rehome these trees, singing their roots back into the soil. Education in our time seems to miss one or the other of these images. Either that education fundamentally must unroot us, jostle us to transform us, or that educators must help students put their roots back into rich soil. At the end of the poem, the singer leaves, the tree mourns the loss, but says that now, after the song, we see more. This poem, this song of the transforming power of attention, beautifully captures the work of American poet Denise Levertov. Now, I am also a T.S. Eliot scholar, and when I mention that I teach T.S. Eliot, I receive immediate reactions of horror or delight. When I mention Levertov, I am asked to spell her name, Levertov for your notes. So believe me, I understood the risk when I decided to offer an upper-level seminar at my institution just this past spring on this 20th century female free verse poet. It was a 3-hour Wednesday evening seminar. One student admitted she thought the course was about a male poet, Dennis Levertov, when she signed up. And the majority felt genuine antipathy for Levertov the moment they saw her unstructured verse on the page. Trained in a tradition of formal, structured poetry, more familiar with Shakespeare's sonnets than free verse, these students were encountering something wholly and completely new to them. And so, with all these promising beginnings, we commenced. We gave Levertov's poetry our attention, truly. Imagine discussing something like 3 poems for 3 hours. These students are heroes. And Levertov's poetry and poetic form taught us what attention means and what it might demand of us. And that's what I'd like to speak about this evening. First, briefly, who is Denise Levertov? She was born in East London in 1923, the daughter of a Hasidic Jew turned Anglican priest. She was steeped in Judeo-Christian religious traditions and the romantic poetry and literary tradition of her country of origin. She married an American and moved to the U.S. in 1948. In the company of the Black Mountain Poets and William Carlos Williams, her poetry found its distinctly American lyric voice. In the late 60s and 70s, her poetry began giving attention to political topics, and she began writing engaged or political verse, protesting the Vietnam War. And for this decision, she lost audiences and friendships. In the 80s and 90s, she made another costly turn, this time into the Christian faith of her youth. She was baptized into the Roman Catholic Church in 1990, won the Christianity and Literature Lifetime Achievement Award in '94, and passed away in 1997. So her biography is awash with paradox, which is perhaps one of the reasons she falls out of syllabi and anthologies. But hers is a voice that models what it means to be moved by literature. So we're going to begin with her poetic form. Levertov's form is founded upon Gerard Manley Hopkins' conception of inscape, that there's an inner landscape or order to what exists. Levertov believes the work of a poet is to find that form or order in what they observe, be it intellectual, physical, or emotional experience, and match the shape of the poem to the shape of the experience. She describes the poet's vocation as, quote, faithful attention to experience, and, another quote, a kind of religious devotion to the truth. So think back to our image of the tree, how it runs after the experience of listening to the song, to know it better, and this attention literally changes the shape of the tree. This image captures Levertov's theory of poetic attention, one that my students thrived under. And her poetry depicts how, in a world charged with the grandeur of God, even subway signs can invite us to taste and see, and holy grains of cereal might summon us into a morning liturgy that lays bare an incarnational world. But for those of you invested in the story of the tree, you remember that root ripping comes next. It did for us too, and it turned out to be just as painful as it sounds. Writing during the 1970s, Levertov and the world watched, for the first time, live footage of a war on TV. I think our parallel today is watching horrific videos of violence on our phones minutes after an event occurs. Never have we had access to so much information, so many statistics, and with so few resources to process or understand what we see. Levertov describes the problem of her own time as raising up a generation with, quote, criminally neglected imaginations. Like T.S. Eliot in The Wasteland, Levertov claims that in a world where we are inundated with violence, the real tragedy is that we have lost the ability to lament. In her poem Tenebrae, she describes how the liturgies of suburbia drown out sounds of violence in foreign countries. In Life at War, she speaks to the numbing sensation this generates, creating a film over the imagination so we see less clearly, less truthfully. We do not know how to attend to a world like this. Aligning herself with a long literary tradition, Levertov posits that this is the role of what she calls the artist guide. Levertov describes the act of giving people harsh facts and images of violence without the companion of art as the equivalent of sending Dante the Pilgrim into the Inferno without a Virgil. Imagine Dante, lost in the dark wood without a Virgil. He'd still be there this evening. The pilgrim's imagination is so broken, so disordered that he needs that ancient bard to teach him again to see, to attend, to ask questions in wonder and not vain curiosity. The Divine Comedy is an education of the imagination, and it clearly requires a kind of root ripping. The hope is that the pain attendant with this act is ordered toward the pilgrim's becoming, not merely the pain of being lost. Like Dante, Levertov's poetic mode is the pedagogy of a singer, a poet, an Orpheus, a Virgil, who guides pilgrims through darkness with a song and urges them follow, albeit with some great discomfort. And it's not incidental but essential to the poetic vision of creativity. Levertov writes, "Crass, complacent obliviousness to suffering obviously does not coexist with imagination. The insensitively cheerful are uncreative." My students and I learned that a full picture of reality demands root ripping, a journey through hell, and we only made it out by strengthening our faculty of attention in imitation of the artist guide. So, like the trees, my students kept following Levertov into her late career. And there we discovered a kind of poetic re-rooting. Interestingly, the same reason that makes Levertov attend to the violence of the 20th century is what makes her attend to its joy, a commitment to a full vision of reality. She writes, quote, "To sing awe, to breathe out praise and celebration is as fundamental an impulse as to lament." Levertov finds space for praise in the everyday, in nature, and in the people living and dead that shaped her poetry. Muriel Rukeyser, Dorothy Day, Wendell Berry, Thomas Merton, but also Julian of Norwich, Oscar Romero, the Virgin Mary, St. Thomas. She pays attention specifically to the stories of the saints, imagines their lives in words, and she writes her way into a conversion. To tackle the story of doubting Thomas, Levertov borrows from the form of the Catholic liturgy, writing what she calls an agnostic mass. To see Thomas rightly, she must use the form of his tradition, quite literally taking his and her own questions to church. And in the poem, she imagines the strangeness of an incarnational faith where God can be met in the form of the world. She asks these questions: what does it mean to call God a lamb, let alone a lamb that takes away the sins of the world? And she says by the time she reaches the final section, the Agnus Dei, she finds herself in a very new position than she was at the beginning of writing the poem. She is replanted, in this instance, in a faith tradition by a new kind of poet guide. It is Levertov's well-worn muscle of attention that helps her re-root. So finally, I'd like to conclude by reflecting on what these poetics of attention might mean for our topic this evening. First, I think Levertov is a valuable, albeit unlikely, conversation partner with the tradition for our time. I describe her poetry, unlike Eliot's, as intentionally hospitable, as in you can leave tonight, buy her selected works, and read a poem, and you'll love it, I promise. One of my students told me she has collected women's voices throughout her time in college that provide a guide for how she wants to live her life, and Levertov's poetry became a new companion. Second, Levertov's mode of poetic attention seems vitally important for us today. Levertov's poetry rests upon the conviction that we need to attend to the fullness of the reality of the world, and we need literature to help us do that rightly. It's not enough to scroll Twitter and take in news, or let this shape our vision of men and women. The algorithm is not a virtuous guide. We need artist guides, and for this reason, life and literature for Levertov are inseparably united. She writes, the interaction of life on art is continuous. Poetry is necessary to the whole man, and that poetry be not divided from the rest of life is necessary to it. Both life and poetry fade, wilt, shrink when they are divorced. Levertov's encouragement toward attention is full, cosmic even, in the Dantean sense. Our job as educators is to provide a path into this cosmic vision for students. But I think the big secret of teaching is that we can't actually teach it all. Every choice to add something to a syllabus leaves out something else, always. But if we don't teach women's voices, are we teaching a full image of reality? We should be cautious of offering an incomplete picture as the whole. I always think we ought to assign women authors or be transparent about the limits inherent to a course. Either way, we should remember our students are paying attention to our syllabi, to us as teachers, as we are guides assigning artist guides. What vision of the fullness of human flourishing are we giving students? Finally, the theologian Janet Martin Soskis writes, "Attention is rewarded with reality." My students say they hope this course sticks around. They still send reply-all emails about squirrels on campus they think Levertov would write poems about. And we spent the final evening of the seminar around my dinner table reading aloud our favorite lines. It was a really memorable evening, and I think it was full of the celebration and lament that Levertov talks about. We read poems where we laughed, read poems where we cried as she talked about loss. And I think I'll look back on that class and that dinner, that moment in time, as a visceral moment of reality. I think at the end of the class, we would all say, along with the tree, that we see more. Thank you.
We are going to take a little bit of time with some discussion among the panelists, and then we'll welcome your questions in about 15 minutes or so. I first want to invite any of you to, if you have any kind of thoughts about those before or after you, if you'd want to share or inquire, anything like that. Does anybody? Any thoughts?
Is that working? Good? Okay. I know I'm a literature teacher, but I did note the strain of literature throughout all three talks, and thinking about where Erica began on the liberal arts. And another way we think about the liberal arts is that they're for their own sake, or the joke is that they're useless. What are you going to do with an English degree? Everyone loves that joke. But one of the things you're going to do is learn how to read literature, and specifically poetry. A few conversations on that. And poetry is developing this faculty of attention and questions, like Katie talked about, and complexity and possibility that Angel talked about in her talk on Emily Dickinson. And I was thinking about how those faculties of attention that are developed through a liberal arts discipline of literature is what we're going to need to think about these questions of what it means to be men and women. You're going to need to learn how to ask questions and sustain complexity and think about these possibilities in a really deep and careful way. And we're seeing a lot of uncareful work on this. And so I was just thinking about how, and again, of course I'm going to think about it through the lens of poetry, but the kind of care and attention that discipline facilitates is the kind of care and attention that I think answering these kinds of questions is going to require, the kinds of questions that Katie was talking about in her classrooms.
So I think my question would be for my colleagues or for all of us is, I love the term that you use, the poetics of attention. And I think that is, one of the greatest challenges that we have right now is because we live in this age of distraction. And it just puts me in mind of, the idea of amusement, kind of the etymology of being without the muses. So that the idea of we are increasingly amused, as opposed to enjoying leisure, or kind of that old Greek idea of schole. And so I wonder, in your experience, what do you see as some of the greater challenges? But then also conversely, what do you think works in terms of pulling our young people back away from amusement and toward a deep leisure that is more like that schole, that is a kind of resting in, a restful attention to what elevates us? Like what works, what's pulling us away, and what works to pull us back? I'd be interested at school, what that looks like for you in your setting.
Let me just add to that, because the question I had and the thing that I just kept hearing, apart from so much poetry, which I wasn't anticipating, which was really beautiful and challenging for me as someone who doesn't read much poetry and ought to, obviously, was just the way in which I think, Angel, you talked really beautiful about the poets as companions, as friends. And I think about going back to Pazan and her sitting in her study and worrying about kind of things and how and her sort of state of being a woman, and that these companions come to her, Lady Reason and Lady Justice and Lady Rectitude. And you see this just the friends, these companions. Like, how do we help develop attention and interiority and leisure and friendship with others, actual flesh and blood possible friends, through helping students have companions in the texts? I'm curious just how we do that. Like, what are the ways?
Yeah. I think one of the things I was trying to say at the end to answer that is recommending Lab Girl by Hope Jaron. She poses, I found out about her because I was watching an interview on PBS, about her releasing her book, and the interviewer said, like, why did you write this book? Like, what you wrote about your, what's so great about what you do, and her profession? And she just said, what I do every day is I ask the most important question is, what does it mean to be truly alive, right? And she's answering that scientifically, poetically, philosophically, as environmentalists, like in every way. And so to me, what, for girls, and I have a son, so I can say this definitely is effective for boys, it's like being around other people who are totally in love with their questions, with, whatever it is, that for young people is very attractive. And I think as adults, I always look at my own interior life, right? How much I read now is much less than what I used to read before I became addicted to my cell phone, right? So if I'm not living in a way where I am seized by my own questions and just, curious, and we have to ask ourselves as adults, like, if we're not doing it, then why would we expect, our young people to do it? So to me, it's what I find in education is the girls and boys too, if they see their exemplars in love with their questions. So, I always say to parents, get an avocation, get a hobby, get excited about something, because that is actually that is going to be contagious with your own child, so they themselves will be able to, build their imagination, which is what is at stake right now.
I love that and completely agree. I love that idea of being seized by questions. I also love the idea of self-consciously thinking about our phone use more. And I've had some conversations with some colleagues about this. It's like the elephant in the room no one's talking about. And it's reforming our powers of attention. So I start my unit on lyric poetry by asking students, what is the effect of being on your phone? And like every hand shoots up, like the people who don't talk in class are like, it's destroying my attention. It's making me not notice the world. I don't have as good of friendships as I could have. And we're like, okay. But I think it speaks to the fact that students are so aware of the damage it's doing to themselves, and they're begging maybe for a way out. And so what does it look like, one, to model it, two, to not just say don't be on your phone, but what else are you going to do? So I introduced lyric poetry as the anti-phone technology. Poetry is a technology. It's a memory tool ever since Homer. But it fosters attention. It fosters your connection to the world. I said, print out the poem I'm making you memorize for your quiz, put it in your back pocket, and when you're in line at the grocery store and you want to grab your phone, you'll have a poem in your pocket. Another thing that I do is I give them an extra credit assignment, totally optional, where they go 24 hours without their phones. And I say, this is going to teach you what your phone is for, like your alarm. I've had students miss class. It's good for calling your mom. And so what is the tool, or what problem is it solving? And then what problems is it creating? And they send me back these beautiful narratives about, I studied more, I paid more attention, I was late to dinner, I should buy a watch. But I think self-consciously engaging with these questions with students and then giving them something else to practice and pay attention to, or like the two practices together, and I think students are just begging for it.
Yeah, I think the phones are key as the problem. There's another term that you used in the talk, criminally neglected imagination, which I really loved. I've just been thinking about the imagination a lot. And I think there's something about, I'm also thinking about Christine de Pizan sitting in her study and being visited by ladies, rectitude, reason, and justice. You know, like it's this wonderful vision. You know, I'm sitting alone in my study, and they just appear, right? Luckily, she had no cell phones, right? So she couldn't scroll. And I think boredom, you know, like no one's allowed to be bored anymore. So the minute you might possibly be bored, it's an emergency, and so you have to then go on the phone or do some other kind of fiddling. But I wanted to just think some more about this idea of the criminally neglected imagination. And then that brings to mind the idea of the moral imagination. So we were talking about this a little bit before. And just, you know, what is the role of the imagination in cultivating the self, you know, and especially for young girls and young women, what is the role of the imagination? How is that imagination perhaps hijacked by these devices or other kinds of distractions? And there are a couple of different ways of thinking about it, but I like Iris Murdoch's definition of the moral imagination as the capacity humans have of making pictures of the world and coming to resemble those pictures. So if those pictures are on the cell phone, you know, what are we coming to resemble? Like we're making these pictures of the world. We're going to long for and desire something. And then the other way of thinking about the moral imagination that I like is Russell Kirk when he reflects on how the cultivation of the moral imagination is important because you're getting the kinds of stories that we are providing to our young people is conducive, hopefully, to right order in the soul and right order in the commonwealth. So there's a connection there between the soul and the kinds of souls that we're cultivating and the larger commonwealth. And so there are civic consequences to the kind of imagination that we are or are not cultivating. So I just love to kind of hear more about imagination. You know, what is it? How do we cultivate it? I don't know. Any thoughts?
So one thing I'm thinking about this year is the relationship between experience, imagination, and creativity. Because we have these habits of mind, heart, and character, which we list in all of our classrooms, and we define them with I statements. And for creativity, I really don't like it, but at least I think it sort of gets at what we're talking about, which is I use my imagination to solve problems. And it sounds very utilitarian, so I'm like, well, problems, that's not it. But I really focus on this idea of imagination. And one of the things I thought about, because I read this book this summer called The Extinction of Experience by Christine Rosen, which talks about because all of reality is now mediated through technology, even if we don't have the phone, we're still sort of very much affected by the technological apparatus, which we can't extract ourselves from. And that really is making it difficult for us to actually have real, true experiences, right? This idea of touching grass, right? So we have a generation more now of young people who really just don't have a repository of experience, of just actual experience. And that directly affects your imagination. And at the beginning of the year, I told the story to the students that, because I spent a couple days in Oxford this summer with my family, and we spent time under a beautiful tree, like a 500-year-old tree that actually Tolkien spent a lot of time when he studied there as a student. And that tree as a student really was his inspiration for the Ents and the character of Lord of the Rings. So I had on my slide, the picture of the tree, then a sketch of the Ents, of the character, and then the actual book, The Lord of the Rings. And I was trying to show them like how experience leads to forming your imagination, which then leads to creativity. So, I'm in a secondary school, I'm not with university students, but this is so important. So it's always about experience. Experiences should be transformational. They should be experiences. So to me, that's one area that we need to be thinking more about.
Okay, well, we can start moving to Q&A while I ask one other question of transition. And that is, we've talked a lot about kind of attention, experience, friendship, and of course the technological mediation that is everywhere. What about the way in which, that I mentioned, I think I may be the only one who mentioned it, just the career mentality? Is that still something that is capturing young people? Is it something that pulls them away from thinking that attending to poetry is important? Because kind of how is it useful? Like, how is this useful to my, competing in the global market? You know what I mean? And I wonder if you maybe could think about that. Like, does that question emerge? And is there a way to think about or to help them understand that, in fact, you do need to make money, you do need to feed yourself and your family, et cetera. So is there a way that, in a non-utilitarian way, you could talk about how becoming more attentive, both to experience, to poetry, et cetera, not only helps you to love better, as like Simone Weil would say, but also helps you to actually work better and actually contribute kind of to the common good in whatever vocation or profession you have?
Yeah, I think this comes up, and I love the idea that in our conversation we're like raising the stakes of the imagination, because how you imagine yourself in a career, I think, is an important question, and we discuss this a lot in my courses. I write a lot on Wendell Berry, I teach classes on him, and there's a line from Berry that really strikes my students where he says, "A career is not an adequate context for a life." And so all his works are about filling up what the meaning of work is, and that it is the job that you do, it is the daughter, sister, mother, friend, husband, son, citizen, person that you are in the world. All of that is a part of your work. And that is, once again, back to the imagination. It's something you have to cultivate and say, all these attendant responsibilities are a part of your work. For women, this could be more obvious if there's a child you just had right there. But for men, it is the same imaginative act of saying, all of this is my work. And so I think that authors that push students away from thinking that a career is an adequate context for a life, and that all of these aspects of life are their work, and a vocation is a bigger, fuller question than just the job that you have. I think that is an imagination question. And so back to cultivating a vision and back to reading stories about different kinds of people doing different kinds of work and raising up the dignity of their work in the home or outside of the home. It feels really central.
Yeah, I think on this utilitarian aspect, I see quite a lot of that in the college students. And, I think there may be some kind of structural reasons for that in terms of, increased competition in college admissions and, transitions in the economy and so on and so forth. But I think it also is the way young people imagine themselves. I think it really is that the stories, what kind of story have they been embedded in 21st century America, right? And what are they reading? And, does that kind of reading elevate them, or does it, kind of insert them even more firmly into the rat race. In terms of usefulness, this makes me think of Martha Nussbaum, the philosopher, who she insists that her students read novels. And they're students who are going to law school, and she writes about this in Poetic Justice, and she says, why don't I have them read history or biography? She's like, they could do that too, but there's something about literature and the role-taking of literature and the engaging of the emotions and the psychology of decision-making and ethics, that is more morally formative. And so reading, literature, poetry, engages us in very different ways. And so, to the extent that young people are so kind of goal-oriented on where's the money, it's a very sterile kind of life, right? And reading poetry seems like a quote-unquote waste of time, but it's really tragic if that's the case. But I've talked with my students about this, and I've said, I had some really kind of heartbreaking conversations in some of my classes where students would say, I'd love to study history or philosophy, but I can't. There's no way to make money with that, and so I just can't. It's just off the table. And I think part of it is, I love what you do by bringing in mothers and having them be on a panel and talk about their lives. I think our young people are also very hungry for that and don't know they're hungry for it, because when you get to talking to real flesh and blood people about the paths they took to the work that they have, and this is another thing that I think is really important for young women who might have aspirations to become mothers, what are the possibilities that they might write off because they can't imagine themselves, living a certain life. We're having flesh and blood exemplars come in and give their stories of how they ended up where they were, how they integrated work and motherhood. I have students ask me this all the time, and it's not the kind of thing that's on the syllabus, right? But it's stunning to me how many assumptions they make about what they have to do and how they have to stay on the career track in a particular way. And so I think we have a kind of a mismatch between, of imagination in terms of what's possible.
Sir, please.
Thank you all so very much. This was incredibly informative for me. I loved it. Thank you. Teaching civics here at ASU, I've encountered the challenge that students think and sometimes say in class, well, art and imagination and beauty are completely subjective so that we can't really talk about them. And then they shut down. They don't want to talk about them. What are some helpful ways that we as teachers can think about engaging with that particular challenge to art and beauty?
I could speak for my own discipline here. I'm going to bring it back to poetry just as an example. I think I like to say that poems include so many possibilities. That's why we like the genre, but just because it can mean so many things doesn't mean it can mean anything. And so thinking about the meanings of words together and thinking about possibilities that exist for words, and then just having a conversation, and I think if you build enough of a community in the classroom, you can kind of, I have a student that'll suddenly say I'm wondering if this word also means, and then someone else will be like, no, it doesn't mean that. And I love seeing students correct each other on readings and the many meanings of a word versus what it can't mean. Or if you look at a formal sonnet, right, and you say actually then the line's end, it has to be 14 lines. What are forms that contain things? Before moving into free verse forms that can contain so much. And so this is just on a very granular, close reading level, but I actually wonder if the practice of doing it in some kind of focused practice in whatever your discipline is on a close reading level could help think through subjective, how do you read through objectively what these words can mean, what this poem allows for, or what this text you're reading allows for as a classroom? Could be a way of doing that on a granular level, and then kind of moving to the more abstract from there. And obviously that's the work of poetry, from like the specific to the abstract. I wonder if it could be a practice to help with that. And I found my students are sometimes adverse to opening up all the possibilities of something. They want one meaning. And so my work is opening up more meanings for them, but I wonder if it could also work the opposite direction in those kinds of exercises with students.
Yeah, I find that really fascinating that your students have that approach. I mean, I guess I shouldn't be surprised. I think that's probably a message that they're getting in more than one place. But I guess thinking in terms of, truth, beauty, and goodness, we tend to have a focus on, truth, truth interpreted as facts, which, the facts are not the only truth, but truth and goodness. And then beauty is often kind of the stepsister, off to the side, right? For the reasons that you say. Whereas I think in the tradition, the understanding is that they're all connected, right? And Solzhenitsyn talks about this in his Nobel Prize speech, where he says, places that truth and goodness can't go, beauty can, and then she brings her sisters with her. Is the way that he talks about it. And so I think maybe helping them to see how they are connected with each other, and if we're really committed to truth, just think about when you're trying to convince someone of something, that you think is crucially important, and the facts are often not getting to them, right? And a lot of times it's because people have this kind of inchoate sense of, this vision of the world that they want to live. And there's an aesthetics to that vision, right? There's a story that they've inserted themselves in or given themselves over to, that they're enchanted by, and facts are not going to pierce that. And so being able, I think beauty is able to get in there. Lewis writes about this as well in a short piece on the fairy story, where he talks about how stories can sometimes get through the watchful dragons of reason, where you kind of put up these barriers, right? The facts will not get through. But beauty somehow slithers through there, and kind of, it's like, I hadn't, that kind of vision so I think seeing them as intertwined, and then also seeing that there's a kind of violence in amputating vision from truth and goodness. And so that one can think, well, I'm doing I'm hewing to the truth and the goodness, but you've just amputated beauty. You've just, taken something central to the human soul out of the thing, should be a concern. And a book that I found to be useful in this is Elaine Scarry's On Beauty and Being Just. And I think she does a really good job of talking about this and talking about exactly the objection that your students have. And it's a very slender volume, I think really very accessible.
I would just add that that's what I've been trying to do with the exemplars, which is, I think young people suffer, this is not their fault. I would say it's my fault. I would say as an adult, I feel like, well, how have I, contributed to this at 55? But having a deficit coming into this world or maturing without a lot of direct experience of the real world, right? Not having a lot of experience. I knew it was bad when so many of the 16-year-olds didn't want their license, their driver's license, and I was like, okay, something has gone wrong like 20 years ago. And, now that's they're shuttled around without, and then you have then not having, like Martha Nussbaum's comment about going to law school and saying, now you need to read novels to really understand people, so they're not reading either. So then their imagination is, there's just so much poverty, right, in their imagination. So to me, it's like just showing all the exemplars, like all the great mathematicians, scientists, all the great innovators, have, like, their imagination it's not about a particular discipline. It is about driven questions. And so to me, that's why I always talk about noble purpose. If you can get them to really say, it's not your job. What is your noble purpose? You have this, everyone in the world has this, unique and unrepeatable purpose that you're here to discover. And that is what's going to drive you, and it's going to make you ultimately successful in your career, but that's a byproduct. That's not the intent. And so to me, it's like once they see all the exemplars that are driven by their questions, then it doesn't become this debate about, about whether something is, subjective or objective. Because the reality is the people who are producing objectively great things have an incredibly subjective, full, flourishing life, and, they want both.
Hello, thank you all so much. You've given us all a lot to think about. I am a mother of 2 young girls. I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. And right now, the forefront of my mind constantly is how am I going to shape them to be well-rounded individuals? And part of that is recognizing you can't do everything. You could do one thing really well. You can do all the things kind of sort of well, which I think there's like the Greek virtue of paideia, being mediocre in all things, but all of them. And that's something I want to foster in my children, while simultaneously acknowledging that you do have to put food on the table, have a career. That's a conversation my husband and I have been having a lot. We went to a liberal arts university, but he was a computer science major, I was a politics major. And we see some of our friends who are English majors and art majors and ceramic majors really struggling to navigate, today's economy as young people. It's just truly difficult. And leisure, in a sense, on one hand feels like a luxury good, and on the other hand feels like something that you prioritize. If you prioritize it in an academic sense, it's to your own detriment financially. So navigating the complexities of this and fostering well-rounded children, something that came up in all of your remarks. I think we have the beauty of the home and the mother and the poetry on the walls and the garden and women coming in and speaking at the schools. So something that really struck me as problematic for women's education and for education as a whole is just the compartmentalization aspect of, my bad. You do a job to make money. Maybe you have a vocation, or you're a mom or a dad on the side. Marriage is a capstone. There's a step of order of events you have to go through. So I just would like to hear what your thoughts are on how we foster a more well-rounded environment for our children, and how you reduce this compartmentalization and kind of increase fluidity of education as something that anyone can do. It doesn't require a college degree. It doesn't require material wealth, but it does require consciousness and dedication. So how do we foster that for our children? Sorry, that was long.
Just a quick thought. I just finished Leah Libresco-Sargent's new book, The Dignity of Dependence, and something that struck me last night while I was reading it on the plane is her description of the interruptions attendant with life with children and letting those be a space for some kind of creativity. I was saying, let that interruption be something that shapes your life to say, I'm going to stop and play now, right? And thinking about children's play, like liberal education, as something for its own sake. And so it is interesting to think about, what kind of, comprehensive vision can everyone cultivate? Well, everyone has distractions that are connected to people. And so whether it's children or colleagues or students, and so what does it mean to welcome those with a kind of hospitality as opposed to a disruption is actually modeling a more humane world for our students and children and peers and friends, and saying, well, this is the purpose, this kind of human communion and connection. It's not a disruption, it's the thing that we're doing. So that feels like one place to start is actually just in human interactions, which feels connected to everything we've said about technology and poetry and time and attention. What's it all for? It's for being a human. And so that feels like a really simple thing that she gives in the book, and I do recommend the book as well.
So I'm going to say some things that are going to sound very strange. So I'm just going to preface it. And I think it comes out of my training in sociology, where we pay a lot of attention to structural foundations of society and how they can tend to shape our lives, whether we want them to shape our lives or not. So in your question, as I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking about the structure of the workplace, thinking about the structure of your typical school day. I have 2 daughters. I'm thinking about the decisions we make about where to live and what kind of commute we're going to have. It's another kind of structural, factor. It's very hard. If we are pursuing the standard American dream story, it's very hard to do what you're talking about, right? So you're most likely going to be in a house suburban-like, or kind of, and have a, something of a commute by a car. The kids are going to be in a school most of the day. You're going to be at work most of the day. I'm not saying it can't happen. It's just the reality of the thing is it's very difficult, right? And so I think one has to kind of take a really hard look at those structural foundations, and then take another hard look at what one is willing to do. So in my particular strange case, I've been able to make decisions where I live close to where I work and either bike or walk, and that has been my entire life, and I'm 53. It means that there's a lot of time I'm not spending in my car, and that's been very intentional. For a good portion of my career, I homeschooled my daughters, which meant that they were not in a standard school setting. Nothing against the standard school setting. They finished in a regular school, but for most of their lives they were homeschooled. And so I have the perspective of having homeschooled them and then having them in a school, and it completely changes the entire schedule of the entire family. There's just less flexibility, and I had more time with them. I was able to mold them more, read aloud with them. We're Christians, so more Bible reading time. There's just so much you can do if you're kind of in the standard structure of things. So that's not to say that one thing is better than another. I did actually send them to school later, 7th and 10th grade. They did go to a classical school. So I've used both, and I think both having the options are important. I just throw this out there to say that there are trade-offs, and so I don't know how to do any magic to change the structural realities of life, but there are trade-offs, and there is imagination. I think this is one of the things I like to try to get my college students to think through is, does it have to be the way everyone else in society says it has to be? Are you sure it has to be that way? Are there other ways to do it, even though people might look at you oddly? And the course that I'm teaching right now is called Freedom and Flourishing in Political and Social Thought. It's on this question of what is freedom, what does it mean to be free, and flourishing, what does it mean to be happy? And one of the things I bring back before them over and over again is, so you're here at the University of Virginia, you're doing the conventional thing, that's great, I think that's wonderful, I'm glad that you're reading these great texts. When you leave here, what are you gonna do with that? Does it have to be, the standard package? Is there something else you can do? And that's why I really push them on what does it mean to be free? Does it mean to have the standard package that the society holds out to you? What does it mean to be happy? Have you just accepted, what the social media is telling you, or what the culture is telling you about what it means to be happy? So anyway, that's my long, rambling answer. I think one has to be, in order to do what you're saying, one has to be ruthlessly intentional. Yes. And it's hard. It's very hard.
Rick, do I have time for?
Can I just say that these two women are very wise and virtuous? And you should listen to them, because I have nothing else to say.
Oh, okay, Susan sat down. Okay, so do you want to, are we done? Yes, we're done. Okay, thank you very much for coming.